The Resonance Matrix, Volume 2, Episode 10, Extortion, When the Field Closes. Hello, and welcome to the Resonance Matrix, a mirror linguistic hypothesis series. Volume 2, The Anatomy of Influence and the Linguistic Somatic Decode. Episode 10, Extortion, When the Field Closes. There is a moment when influence no longer speaks in arguments, signals, or invitations, not because it has persuaded you, but because persuasion is no longer required. This episode opens at that moment, the point at which the field no longer needs to shape perception, harvest emotion, or soften resistance, because resistance itself has become biologically unavailable. Extortion is not the escalation of pressure, it is the end of movement. It is the closing of the field. By the time extortion appears, the nervous system has already traveled a long way. Across this volume, we have followed language as it moved from atmosphere to instruction, from suggestion to certainty, from comfort to containment. Propaganda tuned the environment before it was questioned. Dogmatism hardened meaning until nuance collapsed. Instigation injected restless heat into the system. Deception fractured orientation. Provocation harvested emotional energy. Seduction softened vigilance. Gaslighting eroded internal reference. Bribery replaced resistance with relief. Coercion narrowed the corridor until only one direction remained. Extortion does not add another mechanism to this sequence. It completes it. At this stage, language no longer operates as an influence in the conventional sense. It does not aim to convince, motivate, or inspire. It functions instead as structural closure, a linguistic architecture designed to eliminate variability in behavior by eliminating the nervous system's capacity to explore alternatives. In mirror linguistic terms, the feedback loop between environment and the body and the brain has become one way. The field no longer mirrors, it dictates. And the body, recognizing the absence of viable movement, complies not through agreement, but through shutdown. This is why extortion is so often misunderstood. People imagine it as a dramatic ultimatum, a visible threat, a moment of confrontation. But in its most effective form, extortion is quiet. It arrives after the noise has already done its work. It does not shout because shouting would remobilize the system. It does not argue because an argument implies choice. It simply presents inevitability. Do this, or what little stability remains will be withdrawn. Remain silent, or the pressure intensifies. Comply, or the cost becomes unmanageable. The specific words vary, but the somatic message is always the same. There is nowhere left to go. The body understands this immediately, not intellectually, but biologically. The sympathetic charge that once fueled resistance no longer fires. The ventral openness that once allowed negotiation is gone. What emerges instead is dorsal dominance, a collapse of tone, a narrowing of awareness, a reduction in metabolic demand. Breath becomes shallow or suspended. Musculature softens. Time distorts. Cognition slows, not because the person has given up, but because the organism has correctly assessed that movement now increases danger rather than resolves it. Extortion succeeds not by creating fear, but by making fear unnecessary. Within MLH field theory, this moment represents total environmental saturation. The field has become so coherent, so closed, that internal signal generation is no longer adaptive. Earlier in the descent, the nervous system still experimented, testing boundaries, expressing discomfort, probing for responsiveness. Here, experimentation stops. The predictive model has been updated fully. Expression worsens conditions. Silence stabilizes them. Compliance reduces harm. Stillness preserves energy. The system does not debate this conclusion. It enacts it. This is why extortion often feels anticlimactic to those observing it from the outside. There is no explosion, no dramatic collapse, no visible struggle. What there is instead is quiet acquiescence, withdrawal, numbness, and resignation. People describe it as I just needed it to stop or there was nothing else I could do. These are not stories the mind invents after the fact. They are accurate reports of a nervous system that has reached the end of its available degrees of freedom. Extortion also reveals something deeply uncomfortable about influence itself. It shows that the final mechanism of control is not belief, ideology, or emotion, but constraint. When the field removes alternatives slowly enough, the final closure feels natural, even logical. The person does not experience themselves as being forced. They experience themselves as having no viable options. This is not an illusion. It is a structural reality. And this is why extortion must be understood as a field phenomenon, not merely an interpersonal one. It emerges wherever dependency has been engineered, alternatives quietly removed, and consequences framed as unavoidable. It can exist in relationships, institutions, families, workplaces, states, anywhere the environment has been shaped to narrow movement long before the final lock is applied. By the time extortion appears, the work has already been done. This episode does not approach extortion as a moral category or a legal definition. It approaches it as a biological endpoint, the final extraction of agency once language has fully reorganized the nervous system's response to pressure. We are not here to dramatize it, and we are not here to assign villains. We are here to map the moment when the body recognizes that resistance is no longer metabolically possible, and silence becomes the only remaining form of self-preservation. As you enter this episode, notice what happens in your own system when inevitability is named. Notice whether the body tightens, softens, or goes still. Extortion is not an abstract concept. It is a felt state, one that many people have entered without ever being able to explain how they arrived there. This is the final word of the descent, because it is the point at which words themselves stop functioning as dialogue. From here, the series does not descend further. There is nowhere lower to go. What remains is not more pressure, but total containment. In the sections that follow, we will trace how extortion is delivered linguistically, how it traps the nervous system by offering peace through silence, and why biological shutdown is so often misinterpreted as calm. Only after that mapping is complete will we gesture toward what comes next, not within this volume, but beyond it. For now, stay here, at the edge where movement ends, at the point where the field closes, at the place where compliance is no longer chosen, but quietly enforced by the body itself. The atmospheric hook, the lockdown quiet extortion, does not enter as a force. It enters as silence that cannot be broken without consequence. By the time the system reaches this stage, there is very little left to interpret. The field has already taught the body everything it needs to know. The environment has become predictable in one specific way. Deviation worsens conditions, compliance stabilizes them, and resistance no longer produces movement, only cost. This is not fear in the conventional sense. Fear implies urgency, escape, and mobilization. Extortion arrives when urgency has burned itself out and escape has been quietly removed. The atmosphere here is not tense. It is heavy, not heavy with threat, but with inevitability. A kind of acoustic dampening settles across perception. Conversations shorten. Options stop appearing. Even imagination narrows. People often describe this phase as things just went quiet, or I stopped trying to explain, or I knew it wouldn't matter anymore. These are not emotional reactions. They are biological recognitions. The nervous system has updated its map of the environment and found no remaining routes. Earlier in the descent, language was active. It provoked, seduced, corrected, pressured, and negotiated. Here, language becomes sparse. When words appear, they are simple, final, and framed as facts rather than choices. This is how it is. There's nothing else that can be done. You know what will happen if you don't. Even when these sentences are never spoken explicitly, the field communicates them clearly. Tone does the work. Context does the work. The absence of alternatives does the work. This is the defining atmosphere of extortion, closure without announcement. The body senses this closure before the mind can articulate it. Breath changes first, not a gasp, not a spike, but a reduction. Inhalations shorten, exhalations linger or disappear. Muscular tone drops not into relaxation, but into resignation. The eyes stop scanning, attention narrows inward. Time begins to feel flattened, as though the future has been compressed into a single, repetitive present. These are not symptoms of passivity. They are signs of a system conserving energy in an environment where action no longer improves outcomes. From the perspective of the mirror linguistic hypothesis, this is the moment where language no longer mirrors internal state, but enforces environmental finality. Earlier, words shaped perception, emotion, and belief. Here, words serve a different function. They confirm that the field has closed. They signal that variability is no longer welcome. That meaning has been decided elsewhere, that the system's role is now compliance, not participation. Extortion thrives in environments where dependency has been carefully cultivated, not always materially, though material dependence is common. Often the dependency is emotional, relational, reputational, or existential. Access to safety, belonging, stability, or identity has been gradually externalized. By the time extortion appears, the individual no longer experiences themselves as standing within the field. They experience themselves as being held by it. Leaving does not feel like a decision. It feels like annihilation. And so the atmosphere remains calm. This calm is deceptive and deeply misunderstood. Observers often mistake it for acceptance, maturity, or peace. But what they are witnessing is not resolution. It is shut down without drama. The nervous system has entered a state where survival is prioritized through minimization. Less movement, less expression, less friction, less self. One of the most unsettling qualities of extortion is that it rarely needs to be repeated. Once the field has demonstrated its capacity to withdraw safety, support, or stability, the threat no longer needs to be voiced. The body remembers. The predictive models have been updated. Silence becomes self-enforcing. This is why extortion is so efficient. It does not require ongoing pressure. It installs a constraint that the organism maintains itself. The atmosphere of extortion is therefore not one of conflict, but of containment. There are walls, but they are invisible. Doors, but they are implied rather than locked. The person may still move, speak, and act, but only within a narrowing corridor of permitted behavior. Outside that corridor lies loss, and because loss has already been demonstrated, the system does not need to test it again. In this way, extortion completes the work that coercion began. Coercion narrowed the funnel. Extortion seals it. This sealing is not dramatic. It often feels anticlimactic. People report that they expected something worse, a confrontation, a breaking point, a final argument. Instead, what arrives is a quiet sense of finality, a knowing that further effort is pointless. That explanation will not help. That pushing will only tighten the constraint. The nervous system, recognizing this, opts for the strategy that has the highest probability of reducing harm, stillness. This is where extortion differs fundamentally from earlier stages of influence. Earlier mechanisms relied on engagement. Even gaslighting required dialogue. Even bribery required desire. Extortion requires none of these. It functions precisely because the system has been conditioned not to want, not to question, not to move. Within MLH field theory, this is described as total linguistic saturation. The environment has become so coherent, so internally consistent, that the individual's internal signals are no longer used to generate meaning. Meaning is supplied externally and accepted without integration, not because it is believed, but because there is no alternative substrate from which to generate belief. This is why extortion is often invisible to those who have not experienced it. It leaves no obvious marks. The person may appear calm, compliant, even functional. They may continue to show up, perform roles, and meet expectations. But internally, something has closed. The sense of agency has been withdrawn, not stolen. The distinction matters. Extortion does not take agency away violently. It renders the agency biologically unavailable. The atmosphere of extortion is therefore one of quiet captivity, not imprisonment in the conventional sense, but enclosure of possibility. The system adapts by shrinking its horizon. Desires go dormant. Curiosity fades. Expression becomes utilitarian. Life is organized around the avoidance of consequences rather than the pursuit of alignment. It is important to say this clearly. None of this happens because the person is weak. It happens because the nervous system is doing exactly what it evolved to do under conditions of unavoidable constraint. When escape is impossible and resistance worsens outcomes, mammals conserve energy. They freeze. They submit. They go still. This is not pathology. It is survival. Extortion exploits this ancient biology by engineering environments where constraint is not immediate, but cumulative. Each stage of the descent removes another degree of freedom. Each phase narrows the system's options. By the time extortion appears, the organism is not choosing silence. Silence has become the safest available state. This is why extortion often produces profound shame after the fact. People ask themselves why they didn't fight back, or didn't leave sooner, or let it happen. These questions misunderstand the sequence entirely. There was no single moment where fighting back would have worked. The field was designed to close slowly enough that the body adapted at each step. The atmosphere of extortion is therefore not just about pressure. It is about finality without acknowledgement. No one says, "You are trapped now." The field simply behaves as though escape no longer exists, and the body, exquisitely attuned to such signals, responds accordingly. As this episode unfolds, we will move from this atmospheric recognition into more explicit decoding. How extortion is delivered linguistically, how it exploits relief and gratitude, how it masquerades as protection or necessity, and how biological shutdown is misread as peace. But before any of that analysis can land, the atmosphere must be felt. If you notice a heaviness as you read this, do not push it away. That heaviness is not despair, it is recognition. Extortion is not loud. It does not announce itself. It settles. It quiets. It closes the field. This section ends here in that quiet, not as a conclusion, but as an orientation. The silence that follows pressure. The stillness that arrives when options disappear. The moment when the body understands what the mind is still trying to name. In the next section, we will begin to trace how this closure is constructed linguistically, how extortion is spoken not as a threat, but as inevitability, duty, consequence, and care. For now, stay with the atmosphere. This is the last descent point of Volume 2. Everything beyond this belongs to a different movement entirely. The etymology and definition of extortion, to extract under constraint before extortion, was a psychological condition. It was a legal term. Before it was legal, it was economic. Before it was economic, it was biological. The word extortion derives from the Latin extorca, ex meaning out of, and torcere meaning to twist, wrench, or force. Its earliest meaning is not threat nor violence, but extraction through pressure. Something is not taken openly. It is pulled out by twisting the conditions around it until release becomes the least damaging option. This matters. Extortion is not defined by what is demanded. It is defined by the environment in which demand occurs. The same request spoken in a different field would be negotiable. Under extortionary conditions, it is no longer a request at all, it is an inevitability dressed as choice. Historically, extortion was associated with corrupt officials who used their position to extract payment under threat of legal consequence. The power was not in the threat itself, but in control of the field, access to justice, safety, and livelihood. Refusal was theoretically possible, but practically catastrophic. The coercive force lived in the asymmetry, not the words. That same structure persists today, though its forms have become more subtle. In modern psychological language, extortion is often collapsed into coercion, blackmail, or abuse. But within the resonance matrix, extortion is treated as something more precise and more terminal. It is not the narrowing of options that is coercion. It is the removal of alternatives altogether. Here is the working definition for this episode, and for the close of Volume 2. Extortion is the linguistic and environmental process by which agency is extracted through the removal of viable alternatives, resulting in biological shutdown rather than resistance. This definition matters because extortion does not function through fear alone. Fear still implies motion. Fear still implies escape. Extortion functions when motion itself becomes too costly, when the nervous system concludes, accurately, that any deviation will worsen conditions. This is why extortion does not require an overt threat. The threat has already been demonstrated. The body remembers. The field no longer needs to speak loudly. Extortion is therefore not loud language. It is the final language. Language that closes rather than persuades. Language that presents outcomes as fixed. Language that frames consequence as natural law rather than choice. You know what happens if you don't. There's nothing else that can be done. This is just how it is. You don't really have a choice here. Even when these phrases are never spoken aloud, they are communicated through context, history, repetition, and silence. And because the nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to patterns of consequence, it registers the message immediately. Within MLH field theory, extortion represents total field dominance. Earlier phases of influence relied on entrainment, synchronizing the internal state to the external rhythm. Extortion arrives when entrainment has succeeded completely. The individual no longer generates rhythm internally, the field supplies it. At this stage, language does not seek agreement, it seeks compliance. And compliance here is not behavioral, it is physiological. The nervous system does not argue with extortion, it conserves it. This is where extortion diverges sharply from manipulation as it is commonly understood. Manipulation implies trickery, persuasion, and deception. Extortion does not trick, it corners. It does not confuse. It clarifies consequences so thoroughly that resistance no longer appears adaptive. In this sense, extortion is brutally honest. It does not promise. It does not seduce. It does not distort reality. It simply defines the limits of movement. And those limits are enforced not through violence, but through dependency. Dependency is the soil in which extortion grows. Dependency may be material, money, housing, legal status, or employment. It may be relational, attachment, approval, belonging, or reputation. It may be existential, identity, meaning, purpose, safety, or survival. The form does not matter. What matters is that something essential has been externalized. Once the nervous system believes that survival, safety, or coherence is located outside itself, extortion becomes possible. This is why extortion is often preceded by periods of apparent support, protection, or rescue. The field first positions itself as the source of stability. Only later does it reveal the cost of maintaining access to that stability. In this way, extortion completes a cycle that began much earlier. Propaganda shaped the field. Dogmatism hardened the meaning. Instigation injected restless heat. Deception fractured reality. Provocation harvested reactivity. Seduction softened resistance. Gaslighting eroded reference. Bribery quieted dissent. Coercion narrowed the funnel. Extortion seals it. It is the moment where the organism understands, without being told, that there is nowhere else to stand. This understanding does not arrive in panic. Panic would require hope. Panic requires the belief that escape might still be possible. Extortion arrives when hope has already been metabolized and exhausted. What remains is calculation. Calculation is often misunderstood as choice, but calculation under extortion is not free deliberation. It is triage. What will cost the least? What will prolong stability? And what will prevent collapse? These are not philosophical questions. They are biological ones. This is why extortion so often produces compliance that looks calm, mature, or rational. From the outside, the person may appear composed. They may say things like, it's just easier this way, or I don't want to make things worse, or I'm choosing peace. But this is not peace. It is containment, and the body knows the difference. One of the defining characteristics of extortion is that it collapses time. The future no longer feels open. It becomes a repetition of the present. Planning stops. Imagination dulls. The nervous system shifts into maintenance mode: survive today, maintain access, avoid disruption. This temporal flattening is not psychological pessimism. It is an accurate reading of an environment where deviation has already proven costly. Within MLH field theory, this is described as zero resonance closure. The field becomes so internally consistent, so tightly bound, that no new signal can emerge. Meaning no longer evolves. It is enforced. Language in this phase becomes sparse because it no longer needs to work. The work has already been done. Earlier phases required repetition, persuasion, and framing. Extortion requires only a reminder. Often, that reminder is nonverbal. A look, a pause, a withdrawal, a bureaucratic delay, a silence where support once existed. The nervous system reads these cues instantly, and because it has learned the cost of misreading them, it responds conservatively. This is why extortion is rarely experienced as abuse while it is happening. Abuse implies excess. Extortion feels like a necessity. It feels like reality asserting itself. It feels like this is just how things are. That feeling is the mechanism. Extortion succeeds when the individual no longer experiences their compliance as externally imposed, but as internally chosen, not because it is chosen freely, but because the alternative has been rendered unthinkable. This is where shame enters, not from the extorter, but from the self. People ask themselves why they didn't leave. Why did they agree? Why did they stay quiet? Why did they comply? These questions assume that resistance was available. Extortion is defined precisely by the removal of that availability. This is why extortion must be named carefully, not to accuse individuals, but to recognize fields, not to assign blame, but to restore accurate causality. Extortion does not require cruelty. It requires control of consequence. It does not require threats. It requires demonstration. It does not require force. It requires dependency, and once dependency is total, extraction becomes effortless. In the context of this volume, extortion marks the final biological limit of influence. Beyond this point, the nervous system cannot be persuaded further. It can only be shut down. That shutdown is not a failure. It is survival. This section ends here with the word named accurately, stripped of drama, and returned to its original meaning: extraction under constraint. In the next section, we will move from definition into the somatic blueprint of extortion, how this extraction is registered in the body, how freeze replaces fight, and how silence becomes the nervous system's last remaining defense. For now, let the word settle without urgency. Extortion is not loud. It is not chaotic. It is not emotional. It is the quiet moment when the system realizes that movement is no longer rewarded, and stillness becomes the only safe position left. The somatic blueprint total biological freeze extortion is not experienced as fear. Fear still implies motion. Fear mobilizes. Fear prepares the organism to run, to fight, to escape, to negotiate. Fear carries energy. Extortion arrives after that energy has already been spent. The somatic blueprint of extortion is not activation, it is cessation. It is the moment the nervous system concludes, with grim accuracy, that movement no longer improves outcome. To understand this, we need to stop imagining extortion as an emotional state and start understanding it as a biological endpoint, a state the body and brain enter when all prior strategies, engagement, appeasement, vigilance, protest, and reasoning have failed to restore safety or autonomy. The body does not freeze because it is weak. It freezes because it is conserving what little remains. Earlier phases of influence trained the nervous system gradually. Seduction softened vigilance. Gaslighting destabilized the reference. Bribery rewarded silence. Coercion narrowed options. By the time extortion arrives, the organism has already learned a devastating lesson. Every expression costs something. The body does not need to be told this again. It remembers. Memory here is not narrative. It is procedural. It lives in synaptic weighting, hormonal expectation, and autonomic bias. The organism has learned through repetition that deviation increases harm, that speaking up leads to loss, that resistance worsens conditions. This learning is not abstract. It is encoded in physiology. At the level of the autonomic nervous system, extortion corresponds to dorsal vagal dominance, a shutdown response that emerges not from sudden threat, but from inescapable constraint. This is not the freeze of surprise. It is the freeze of no exit. The dorsal vagal system evolved to protect the body and brain in environments where escape is impossible. In prey animals, it appears when capture is certain. In humans, it appears when the nervous system calculates. That resistance will only increase damage. This is not dissociation in the psychological sense alone. It is metabolic triage. Heart rate drops. Blood pressure lowers. Muscle tone collapses. Digestive activity slows. Sensory input dulls. The body and brain reduce energy expenditure to preserve life. This is why extortion often looks calm from the outside. The body has powered down. Neurobiologically, this state reflects a profound shift in brain prioritization. The limbic system no longer prepares for action. The amygdala no longer signals acute threat. Instead, the brainstem assumes command, enforcing survival at minimal output. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of planning, decision-making, and agency, goes offline, not because it is damaged, but because its function is no longer adaptive. Planning implies possibility. Extortion removes the possibility. The brain does not waste energy imagining futures it cannot access. This is where many misunderstand extortion. People often ask why someone didn't think clearly, didn't plan, or didn't leave sooner. These questions assume that cognitive bandwidth was available. Under extortion, cognition is subordinated to containment. One of the most distinctive somatic features of extortion is voice suppression, not metaphorical voice, literal vocal inhibition. The vagus nerve innervates the muscles of the throat, larynx, and face. In dorsal vagal shutdown, these muscles lose tone. Speech becomes quieter, flatter, shorter. Words feel costly. Silence feels safer. This is not a submission. It is biological muting. The body and brain have learned that speech does not restore safety, so it conserves by reducing it. This is why extortion environments often appear peaceful. There is no conflict because the capacity for protest has been biologically disabled. Extortion also collapses interoception, the ability to feel oneself from the inside. Earlier phases destabilize trust in perception. Extortion completes the process by dampening perception itself. Sensations flatten. Emotions feel distant. The body feels heavy or unreal. Time loses texture. This is not numbness by choice. It is a protective reduction of the signal. When sensation repeatedly leads to pain, the nervous system learns to turn down sensation. At the hormonal level, extortion reflects a paradoxical profile. Cortisol may be chronically elevated in the lead-up phases, but during extortion it often drops, not because stress has resolved, but because the stress response has collapsed. Dopamine associated with motivation and pursuit is minimal. Why pursue when nothing changes? Oxytocin, associated with bonding, may be present but distorted, reinforcing attachment to the controlling field rather than restoring safety. This neurochemical profile creates a state that feels eerily calm but is not restorative. It is the calm of surrender, not safety. Neuroplasticity ensures that this state does not end when the extortion ends. Repeated dorsal vagal activation reshapes baseline nervous system settings. The organism learns that stillness equals survival. Over time, this can persist as chronic fatigue, depression, apathy, or emotional flatness, not because the person is broken, but because their nervous system adapted correctly to an extreme environment. This is why extortion leaves such deep scars. It trains the body to survive by disappearing. From an MLH field theory perspective, extortion represents total linguistic closure. Language no longer invites response. It no longer persuades. It no longer argues. It simply defines conditions. You know what will happen. This is the only option. There's nothing else. These phrases do not stimulate cognition. They terminate it. The body receives these messages not as information, but as environmental law, and the nervous system responds the only way it can, by minimizing internal movement. Extortion often coexists with apparent rationality. The field may claim neutrality. It may present itself as procedural, bureaucratic, or unavoidable. This framing further disables resistance because it removes a human agent from the equation. You are not being harmed by a person. You are being harmed by how things work. This abstraction is lethal to agency. The body cannot negotiate with systems. One of the most painful aspects of extortion is that it often arrives after consent. The organism consented earlier to stay, to comply, to appease, to be patient. That consent is later used as evidence that current conditions are acceptable. You agreed to this. You chose this. You stayed. The nervous system experiences this not as accountability, but as betrayal of self. Shame deepens. Freeze consolidates. Importantly, extortion is not always overtly hostile. It can be delivered with politeness, with smiles, with gratitude, with language that frames extraction as reasonable, deserved, or inevitable. This is why extortion is so difficult to name from the inside. It doesn't feel like an attack. It feels like the end of options. At its deepest level, extortion produces existential narrowing. The person stops imagining different lives, stops asking what they want, stops feeling entitled to preference. Identity contracts to function. Stay employed, stay housed, stay connected, stay unnoticed. This is not apathy. It is survival minimalism. The tragedy is that extortion often appears externally as stability. No drama, no conflict, no disruption. But internally, the organism is locked into a state of arrested becoming. Life continues, but growth does not. This section is not meant to alarm. It is meant to restore accurate attribution. If you have experienced extortion, relationally, institutionally, culturally, your body's shutdown was not a failure of courage. It was a correct response to an environment that made movement dangerous. In the next section, we will move from biology into field-level manifestation, how extortion operates in workplaces, families, legal systems, and social structures, and why entire populations can be driven into dorsal compliance without a single overt threat. The field case study: when the environment no longer offers exit, extortion does not begin with a demand. It begins when the environment stops responding to dissent. At first, nothing looks different. The same corridors are walked, the same conversations occur, the same systems appear to function. From the outside, life continues with a familiar rhythm. But inside the field, a subtle recalibration has already taken place. The organism begins to notice that outcomes no longer vary. That response has become predictable. That deviation no longer produces dialogue, only consequences. This is how extortion establishes itself, not as an act, but as an atmosphere. In earlier phases of influence, the field was still negotiated. Propaganda invited belief. Dogmatism hardened the meaning. Provocation elicited a reaction. Seduction offered relief. Gaslighting destabilized the reference. Bribery rewarded silence. Coercion narrowed pathways. At each stage, movement was still possible, even if costly. Extortion is what remains when movement itself becomes the costliest option. Imagine a person inside a system, not necessarily a relationship, not necessarily a workplace, not necessarily a state. Extortion is not defined by scale. It functions the same way whether the field is intimate or institutional. The person has already learned the rules. They have seen what happens to those who question too openly. They have watched careers stall, friendships cool, support evaporate. They have felt the micro-consequences themselves. Delays, exclusions, subtle punishments that never appear on paper. No one needs to explain the danger. The field has already demonstrated it. This is the critical difference between coercion and extortion. Coercion threatens. Extortion reminds. The body remembers. In extortionary fields, language becomes sparse not because communication has improved, but because it is no longer necessary. The rules are implicit. The penalties are known. Silence becomes efficient. This is why extortion often coincides with professionalism, maturity, or keeping the peace. These are not values in this context. They are survival strategies that have been naturalized. People say things like, "It's just not worth it. You have to pick your battles. That's above my pay grade. Nothing will change anyway." These are not beliefs. They are biological conclusions. Extortionary environments are characterized by unidirectional consequences. Actions only produce harm when they challenge the field. Compliance produces neutrality at best. There is no positive reinforcement for agency, only the absence of punishment. This trains the nervous system with ruthless efficiency. Neuroplasticity does not need intensity. It needs repetition, and in extortionary fields, repetition is constant. Every withheld email, every stalled request, every quiet demotion, every unexplained exclusion. The message is not shouted, it is confirmed. One of the most disorienting aspects of extortion is that it often operates under the banner of legality, policy, or inevitability. The field presents itself as neutral, rules-based, procedural, impersonal. You agreed to this. These are the terms. This is just how the system works. This abstraction is not accidental. It removes the possibility of relational repair. You cannot negotiate with a system that claims neutrality. You cannot appeal to empathy where empathy has been replaced by protocol. From an MLH field perspective, this is where language becomes structural rather than communicative. It no longer conveys meaning between people. It enforces boundaries around behavior, and because the enforcement is framed as external and unavoidable, the nervous system does not mobilize against it. It adapts within it. Extortionary fields often present false alternatives. You can stay and comply, or you can leave and lose everything attached to the field. The existence of a theoretical exit is used to deny the reality of extortion. You're not trapped, the field says. You can always leave. But extortion is not defined by the absence of exits. It is defined by the cost of using them. If leaving means loss of livelihood, housing, community, identity, safety, or survival, then the nervous system reads the exit as non-viable. This is not a weakness. It is an accurate risk assessment. The body does not care about ideology. It cares about consequences. This is why extortion produces such profound shame in retrospect. People look back and ask why they stayed. Why did they agree? Why did they comply? These questions assume that freedom was present. Extortion removes freedom before it removes choice. Choice still exists on paper. Agency does not exist in the body. In relational contexts, extortion often looks like emotional hostage-taking. Affection is conditional. Presence is conditional. Stability is conditional. The person learns, again through experience, not instruction, that certain expressions lead to withdrawal. Silence becomes currency. In institutional contexts, extortion looks like compliance culture. Speak carefully or lose access. Question too much or stall your future. Name harm or become the problem. In collective contexts, extortion looks like normality under pressure. The population adapts. People have lower expectations. Resistance is reframed as extremism. Silence is reframed as reasonableness. No one needs to be policed aggressively. The field does the work. A defining feature of extortionary environments is learned inevitability. People stop asking what should be and focus only on what can be tolerated. Moral imagination collapses. Ethical nuance disappears. Survival replaces meaning. This is not apathy. It is containment. The nervous system has concluded that this is as good as it gets, and that pushing further will make it worse. From the outside, extortionary fields appear stable. There is order, predictability, routine, minimal disruption. This is why such environments are often praised for efficiency, resilience, or discipline. But inside the organism, something else is happening. Life narrows, spontaneity fades, creativity dries up, the future stops expanding. The body lives in maintenance mode. This is why extortion is the final extraction. It does not take something visible, it takes becoming. In this field, people often develop a strange relationship to time. Days blur, months disappear, progress stalls, memory fragments, not because of trauma in the dramatic sense, but because nothing new is allowed to emerge. Neurobiologically, novelty is essential for vitality. When novelty is punished, the brain stops seeking it. Dopaminergic systems quiet down. Motivation fades. People describe this as burnout, depression, numbness, or loss of self, but at its core, it is environmental suffocation. Extortionary fields rarely collapse on their own. They persist because they are metabolically efficient for those who control them. No energy is spent suppressing rebellion because rebellion no longer arises. Compliance has been biologically installed. This is why extortion is so difficult to dismantle from within, not because people do not see it, but because seeing does not restore movement. This section is not meant to incite outrage or hostility. It is meant to restore accuracy. If you have lived inside such a field, relationally, professionally, culturally, your silence was not complicity. It was survival. Your stillness was not consent. It was containment. And your difficulty leaving was not a weakness. It was an accurate assessment of cost. The next section will move into language patterns specific to extortion, how words no longer persuade but close, how gratitude becomes obligation, and how silence is framed as virtue. Extortion is not what someone says to you. It is what the environment teaches your body will happen if you speak, and once the body learns that lesson deeply enough, the extraction is complete. Language patterns, when words become walls. Extortion is the moment language stops inviting response. Earlier phases of influence relied on speech that shaped belief, emotion, or behavior. Propaganda repeated. Dogmatism narrowed the meaning. Seduction softened vigilance. Gaslighting destabilized the reference. Even coercion still spoke in options, however narrow. Extortion is different. Extortion does not argue. It does not convince. It does not explain. It finalizes. Language in extortionary fields does not move meaning forward. It seals it shut. It functions less like communication and more like architecture. Words no longer carry information. They define the limits of motion. This is why extortionary language often feels strangely empty, sparse, procedural, boring. The drama is gone. So is the conversation. What remains is enclosure. One of the first linguistic shifts that signals extortion is the disappearance of dialogue. Questions are no longer answered. They are neutralized. Requests are no longer negotiated. They are deferred indefinitely. Disagreement is not challenged. It is ignored. Silence becomes the dominant speech act. From a nervous system perspective, this is devastatingly effective. Silence under dependency is not neutral. It is instructive. The body reads silence not as absence, but as withdrawal of access, and because access has already been established as necessary to safety, livelihood, belonging, or identity, silence carries a threat without needing to state it. When words are used in extortionary fields, they tend to fall into a small number of patterns, each serving the same function, making resistance feel unnecessary, irrational, or self-destructive. One such pattern is inevitability framing. This is just how it is. There's nothing else that can be done. That's the reality of the situation. These phrases do not threaten. They naturalize constraint. They reframe human decisions as environmental facts. Once framed this way, protest feels childish, like arguing with gravity. The nervous system responds accordingly. You don't fight gravity. You adapt your posture. Another pattern is conditional normalization. We can continue as long as. Everything's fine if you just. There's no issue provided that. Here, compliance is framed not as surrender, but as maintenance of peace. The body is offered stability in exchange for silence. And because earlier phases have already taught the nervous system that disruption is costly, this exchange feels reasonable. This is extortion without menace. Perhaps the most insidious linguistic pattern in extortion is gratitude inversion. You should be grateful after everything we've done. We've been very accommodating. Gratitude, which normally strengthens connection, is weaponized into obligation. The implicit message is clear. Speaking up would not only be inconvenient, but it would be immoral. The nervous system registers this as social danger. Shame activates. Silence deepens. This is why extortion rarely needs anger. Shame is quieter and more binding. Another hallmark is bureaucratic language, policy, procedure, compliance, requirements, framework. These words strip agency from the interaction. There is no one to appeal to, no intention to interrogate. The field presents itself as neutral machinery. From a mirror linguistic hypothesis field theory, MLHFT perspective, this is language operating at its most structural. It no longer mirrors experience, it replaces it. The nervous system does not argue with systems, it submits to them. Extortionary language also collapses time. We'll revisit this later. Now isn't the right moment. Let's park this. Time is used not to resolve, but to exhaust. The longer the resolution is delayed, the more the nervous system adapts to non-resolution. Eventually, the question itself feels irrelevant. This is how voice disappears without being taken. Crucially, extortionary language often avoids explicit commands. Commands would reveal force. Instead, it relies on contextual certainty. You know what will happen. You understand the situation. I don't need to explain this. The body understands. That's the point. Within MLH field theory, extortion represents the final phase of linguistic dominance. Language no longer entrains, it governs. The organism no longer mirrors the field, it orients inside it. Speech becomes redundant, meaning is already decided. Once language reaches this stage, the nervous system no longer prepares responses. It prepares endurance. This is why people emerging from extortionate environments often struggle to speak even when safety returns. Their nervous system learned that speech has no effect, or worse, that it increases harm. Silence became protective, not because they had nothing to say, but because saying had been made biologically dangerous. This section completes the linguistic anatomy of extortion, not as cruelty, not as manipulation, but as closure. Language here does not silence by force. It silences by making speech irrelevant. In the next section, we will move into the sovereign shield, not as resistance, but as the smallest possible return of internal reference under extreme constraint. No fixing, no confronting, no heroic narratives. Just the first quiet signal that the body has not disappeared, only gone quiet to survive. The sovereign shield, the smallest possible return extortion, does not end with escape. That is the first misunderstanding that must be cleared away. Most people imagine freedom as removal from constraint, leaving the job, ending the relationship, exiting the system, crossing the border. But extortion operates at a deeper level than location. It imprints itself into the nervous system's expectations. It teaches the body what happens when it moves, speaks, resists, or hopes. So when extortion ends externally, it often continues internally. The sovereign shield does not begin with action. It begins with permission to register again, which was previously muted to survive. This is not resistance. It is not defiance. It is not reclaiming power. It is allowing a signal to exist without consequence. That is all, and in the body and brain that has lived under extortion, that alone is revolutionary. Earlier in this episode, we named extortion as the removal of viable alternatives and the biological shutdown that follows. The body learned, accurately, that movement worsened conditions. Silence preserved access. Stillness reduced harm. Freeze became intelligence. The sovereign shield does not invalidate that intelligence. It does not ask the nervous system to suddenly trust again, speak again, or re-enter risk. Instead, it introduces the smallest possible deviation from shutdown, not outwardly, but inwardly. A deviation that does not threaten survival. Within the mirror linguistic hypothesis field theory, sovereignty does not mean autonomy in the abstract sense. It means internal reference restored at the smallest survivable scale. Not certainty, not confidence, no choice, reference. The body does not need to take back its voice to begin recovering. It needs to experience one moment, just one, where an internal signal is allowed to exist without being overridden, corrected, punished, or extracted. That moment does not need to be shared. It does not need to be acted upon. It does not need to be explained. It only needs to be felt. Under extortion, the nervous system collapsed in time. The future closed. Possibility vanished. Life became maintenance. The sovereign shield reintroduces microtime. Not the future, not planning, not imagining outcomes, just now, a breath that moves without being managed, a sensation that arises without being judged, a thought that appears without being silenced. This is not mindfulness as a technique. It is not present as practice. It is deconditioning of immediate self-censorship. One of the most damaging legacies of extortion is that the body learns to preemptively suppress signals. Sensation is intercepted before it becomes awareness. Awareness is intercepted before it becomes thought. Thought is intercepted before it becomes speech. The sovereign shield does not push against this chain. It introduces a pause before the interception. This pause is the ineffable gap, not as an idea, but as a lived micro-experience. The moment when a sensation arises and is not immediately managed. The moment when the body says something quietly and nothing happens. No punishment, no extraction, no consequence. That moment is sovereignty. From a neurobiological perspective, this matters because dorsal vagal shutdown is not reversed by activation. It is reversed by safety without demand. The nervous system must experience that signal can exist without triggering a threat. This is why techniques that push expression, confrontation, or boundary setting too early often backfire. They replicate the original condition. Signal leads to cost. The sovereign shield does the opposite. It allows a signal to arise and remain internal. No one needs to hear it. No system needs to respond to it. No outcome needs to change. The body simply learns. This did not make things worse. At first, the signal may be faint, a flicker of irritation that doesn't collapse into shame, a preference that doesn't immediately get dismissed, that appears internally without needing justification, a grief that surfaces without being pushed away. These are not breakthroughs. They are returns to a body that learned to disappear. Importantly, sovereignty here does not mean opposing the field. That would still center the field. The sovereign shield is non-reactive by design. It does not argue with extortion. It does not confront it. It does not demand change. It simply rebuilds an internal reference that is not negotiated. In this sense, sovereignty is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not posture. It does not provoke a response. It exists beneath the field's reach. Language begins to shift subtly at this stage. Not outward language, but inward language. Instead of I can't, the body begins to register I don't want. Instead of it doesn't matter, something like that felt wrong appears. Instead of I should, there is a pause. These are not affirmations. They are signals regaining permission. One of the most important reframes here is this. Recovery from extortion is not about regaining strength. It is about reallowing sensitivity. Sensitivity was not the problem. Sensitivity was what made extortion possible because sensitivity adapts. Now sensitivity becomes the way out, but only when it is no longer punished. From a field theory lens, the sovereign shield represents internal decoupling. The organism is still physically inside the field, but it is no longer fully synchronized to it. The field continues. The rules remain. The constraints persist. But internally, reference begins to re-emerge. This is the beginning of the return to self, not as identity, but as signal integrity. It is critical not to romanticize this stage. Sovereignty here does not feel empowering. It often feels fragile, uncertain, quiet. There may be grief. There may be anger. There may be exhaustion. That does not mean it is not working. It means the body is no longer suppressing what it previously had to survive. Over time, and only over time, this internal permission accumulates. Neuroplasticity does not require insight. It requires repetition without harm. Each moment where a signal arises and nothing bad happens teaches the nervous system something new. Not I am safe now, but signal does not equal danger. That distinction is everything. Eventually, external action may follow. A boundary, a departure, a refusal, a redirection. But those actions are not the sovereign shield. They are consequences of it. The shield itself is internal, quiet, and unobservable, and that is why it works. This section exists to correct a dangerous misconception, that silence under extortion meant the self was gone. It was not gone. It was contained, and containment, when chosen by the body, is not defeat. It is preservation. As we move toward the integration and closing of this volume, it is essential to hold this truth. You do not reclaim yourself by undoing what saved you. You reclaim yourself by allowing what was silenced to return slowly, safely, without cost. That is sovereignty at the end of extraction, not rebellion, not resistance, not noise, but conscious presence and living within the moment. The nervous system after extraction, when stillness is no longer survival extortion, does not end when pressure stops. It ends when the nervous system learns that stillness is no longer required for survival. This distinction matters because the body does not measure freedom the way language does. It does not track contracts, timelines, or declarations. It tracks consequences. And under extortion, consequence was clear. Movement increased threat, expression increased cost, and resistance collapsed options. The safer state was immobility, biological silence. So when extortion ends externally, the body does not immediately update its predictions. It continues operating as if pressure is imminent, because for a long time it was. This is why the aftermath of extortion often feels confusing. There is no relief spike like there was under bribery. There is no fight response like there was under coercion. There is instead a strange, hollow quiet, not peace, not fear, but suspension. The nervous system is waiting. From a neurobiological perspective, this waiting is not indecision. It is pattern verification. During prolonged extortion, the brain's predictive models collapse toward a single rule: do nothing unless necessary. Dopamine pathways flattened, cortisol regulation narrowed. The autonomic system conserved energy by reducing exploratory behavior. This was not a collapse in the psychological sense. It was optimization under constraint. The body became efficient at surviving without a signal. But survival without a signal is not living, and when pressure lifts, the system does not rush forward. It pauses, because the last time it trusted relief, it was wrong. This is where many people misinterpret themselves. They believe something is broken because motivation has not returned. They believe they are numb, lazy, or incapable. They assume they should feel grateful, hopeful, or energized. But the nervous system is not malfunctioning. It is checking the field. Under the mirror linguistic hypothesis field theory, the nervous system does not operate in isolation. It continuously mirrors environmental consistency. After extortion, the environment may appear safer, but the field memory remains encoded. The body does not respond to what is said. It responds to what is repeated, and extortion was repetition without escape. So now the system needs repetition without extraction, not stimulation, not encouragement, not empowerment, but consistency. At this stage, the body is exquisitely sensitive to pressure masquerading as support. Now you're free. You can relax. You should feel better. It's over now. These statements, while well-intentioned, reintroduce demand. They imply a required state, and any required state echoes the structure of extortion itself. The nervous system hears, there is a correct way to be now, so it tightens again. This is why recovery from extortion cannot be rushed, because rushing replicates the original injury, someone else deciding what state the body should occupy. The nervous system after extraction exists in a liminal physiology, not fight, not flight, not freeze, but reorientation. Neuroception, the system's unconscious safety detection, becomes hyper-attentive during this phase. It scans tone, timing, silence, and expectation. It listens not for threat, but for conditions. Is something expected of me? Will this cost later? Is stillness allowed? This is where the sovereign shield from the previous section becomes essential, because without internal reference, reorientation defaults back to appeasement. Biologically, what is slowly returning here is variability. Extortion collapses variability. There is one acceptable response: compliance or disappearance. After extortion, variability must re-emerge before vitality can. Small fluctuations in breath, micro-preferences, momentary curiosity, fleeting irritation. These are not problems. They are signs of life returning to a system that was compressed, but variability feels unsafe at first, because variability once attracted punishment. This is why many people in post-extortion states describe feeling anxious when nothing is wrong. The body has learned that calm precedes extraction, silence precedes demand, stillness precedes cost. So when things are quiet, the system prepares. It is not broken. It is accurate based on prior data. The work here is not reassurance. It is time without consequence. Neuroplasticity does not require explanation. It requires lived contradiction. The body must experience moments where nothing happens after a signal arises. No extraction follows the expression. No cost appears after stillness. Only then do predictive models begin to loosen. This is slow. It is subtle. It cannot be forced, and that slowness is not failure. It is precision. One of the most destabilizing experiences during this phase is the return of emotion without narrative, sadness without story, anger without a target, longing without direction. This happens because extortion severed the link between feeling and action. The system learned that acting was dangerous, so emotion was suppressed upstream. When suppression relaxes, emotion returns before meaning does. This is often misdiagnosed as regression. It is not. It is a signal before interpretation, which is how healthy systems function. From the outside, this phase can look unproductive. From the inside, it can feel disorienting. But within the resonance matrix framework, this is a crucial transition point. The nervous system is no longer governed by extraction logic, but it has not yet trusted expansion. This is the bridge state, and bridges are meant to be crossed slowly. Importantly, this section exists to dismantle one final myth, that extortion ends with defiance. It does not. It ends with neutrality. The body must reach a place where the signal neither threatens nor demands, where sensation exists without urgency, where meaning can wait. Only from there does choice become free and authentic again. Language begins to change subtly here as well. Not proclamations, not declarations, but quiet internal shifts. I notice. I don't want that. I'm not ready. That doesn't feel right. These are not strategies. They are reference stabilizing. This is why Volume 3 is titled Silencing the Field. the return to self. Because after extortion, the self does not re-emerge by speaking louder. It re-emerges when the field no longer determines internal state, and that begins here not with action, but with permission to remain unextracted. In the next section, we will move into integration and closure, completing the 10-word descent without collapsing it into morality, blame, or triumph. Extortion is not the end because it is defeated. It is the end because nothing more can be taken. What follows is not resistance. It is a return. Volume 2 wrap. When nothing more can be taken, there is a particular silence that arrives when a system has been stripped of every remaining lever. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of relief, but the silence that follows exhaustion of extraction. This is where Volume 2 and Phase 3 end, not with clarity, not with victory, but with a question that can no longer be avoided. What remains when pressure no longer works? Across this volume, we have not followed a moral arc, we have followed a biological one. Not good versus evil, not truth versus lies, but signal versus interference. We began in Phase 1 with environmental grooming, the slow conditioning of the field. Propaganda softened collective perception. Dogmatism hardened nuance. Instigation injected restless heat. At no point did autonomy vanish. It was redirected. Attention was shaped. Meaning was framed. Agency was nudged rather than taken. Phase 2 moved closer. Deception fractured coherence. Provocation harvested a reaction. Seduction softened the vagal shield. Each step required less force because each step relied on the previous adaptation. By the time warmth replaced vigilance, choice already felt unnecessary. Phase 3 arrived when persuasion no longer mattered. Bribery didn't silence the voice, it thanked it. Coercion narrowed options until resistance felt pointless, and extortion did the final thing no ideology can do. It made silence safer than speech. This is not a metaphor. This is physiology. If you trace the arc honestly, a pattern emerges that for some is uncomfortable to sit with. Nothing here required belief. No one needed to be convinced. The nervous system adapted long before the mind agreed, and that is the core revelation of this volume. Language did not merely describe reality. It regulated it. Tone mattered more than content. Repetition mattered more than truth. Consequence mattered more than intention. Meaning did not arrive through argument. It arrived through what happened after the signal. Ask yourself, not rhetorically, but somatically, when did you first learn to soften your voice? When did you first feel that certainty cost too much? When did warmth begin to feel safer than clarity? When did relief begin to feel like resolution? These were not intellectual decisions. They were biological updates. Volume 2 has been an anatomy lesson, not a manifesto. We have mapped how power moves before it names itself, how influence works best when it feels reasonable, how compliance often arrives disguised as maturity, how doubt can be trained into virtue, how stillness can be mistaken for peace, and finally how extortion is not the presence of force, but the absence of alternatives. Extortion does not shout, it waits. It waits until movement is too costly, until speech feels dangerous, until silence becomes efficient, and when silence becomes efficient, extraction is complete. This is the moment most frameworks stop. They pivot to outrage, they assign villains, they promise empowerment, but outrage still feeds the field, blame still orients externally. Empowerment, when prescribed, becomes another demand. So we stop here instead, and we ask a quieter, tougher question, if nothing more can be taken. Why does the body still hesitate? Extraction does not end when the pressure ends. It ends when the field loses authority. Throughout Volume 2, a single through line has remained constant. The body does not respond to claims. It responds to patterns. It does not trust explanations. It trusts what repeats without consequence. This is why recovery does not look like rebellion. It looks like neutrality. It looks like a signal without urgency. Preference without defense. Boundaries without announcement. Presence without performance. And that is profoundly unsettling to systems built on extraction. Take a moment now, not to analyze, but to feel. Where did your body, brain, and nervous system adapt to survive? Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but subtly. Where did you learn to pause before speaking? Where did you learn to soften disagreement? Where did you learn that certain truths were expensive? Those adaptations were not mistakes. They were intelligent responses to fields that required them. The injury was not an adaptation. The injury was duration. Volume 2 has not asked you to undo anything. It has asked you to recognize. Recognition restores reference without effort, and reference is the one thing extraction cannot tolerate, because once reference stabilizes, influence loses leverage, not through resistance, but through irrelevance. Consider this carefully. Most systems of control fail not when they are exposed, but when people stop orienting toward them, when the reaction dries up, when compliance loses reward, when silence is no longer strategic. This is why the title of Volume 3 matters. Silencing the field does not mean muting dissent. It means withdrawing nervous system participation from dynamics that feed on it, and that withdrawal cannot be forced. It must be allowed. Ask yourself now gently, honestly, what would it feel like to not rush clarity? What would it feel like to let the signal arrive without interpretation? What would it feel like to not respond immediately, not out of fear, but because nothing is required? This is not apathy. This is the agency returning to baseline. One of the hardest truths in this work is this: freedom does not feel like expansion at first. It feels like emptiness, because pressure-filled space, urgency-filled time, demand-filled identity. When those disappear, there is quiet, and quiet can feel frightening to a system trained to equate stillness with danger. But that quiet is not absence, it is capacity. Throughout this series, we have deliberately avoided offering techniques, not because technique is useless, but because technique still assumes something needs fixing. Extortion taught the body that it was the problem. We are not repeating that lesson. Instead, we have stayed with description long enough for the system to recognize itself, and recognition does something technique never can. It deactivates false necessity. As Volume 2 closes, there is no instruction to carry forward, only a stance of listening without demand, a stance of noticing without correction, a stance of allowing sensation to exist before meaning rushes in. This stance is not passive, it is sovereign, because sovereignty is not control. It is non-extractability, so let this volume end where extraction fails, not with answers, but with orientation restored, not with certainty, but with trust in the first signal, not with declarations, but with permission to remain. A final reflection, not to resolve, but to accompany you forward. If nothing were being taken from you anymore, what would you stop offering automatically? If no one required proof of your perception, what would you allow yourself to notice? If silence were no longer strategic, when would you speak, and when would you not? If urgency were no longer rewarded, what pace would your body choose? These questions do not need answers. They are not prompts. They are thresholds, and thresholds are not crossed by force. They are crossed when the field no longer pulls. This completes the Resonance Matrix, Volume 2, The Anatomy of Influence and the Linguistic Somatic Decode. 10 words, 10 descents, not into darkness, but into clarity about how darkness works. What comes next is not another warning. It is not another exposure. It is not another anatomy of harm. Volume 3 does not map extraction. It maps return, not return to innocence, not return to certainty, but return to self-reference without apology. When the field no longer speaks louder than the body, when silence is chosen, not imposed, when presence is enough, we'll meet you there, not with urgency, not with answers, but with the space where answers no longer need to be taken from you. Volume 3, The Silencing Field Return to Self, awaits. Thank you for entering this field of exploration. The matrix is not something you escape. It is something you learn to feel and perceive. Once you begin to recognize it through feeling and self-awareness, perception becomes less confined by certainty and more guided by awareness. You've been listening to the Resonance Matrix Volume 2, The Anatomy of Influence and the Linguistic Somatic Decode, Episode 10, Extortion. I'm James Miller.